Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafitz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? How is law important to understanding the film? And what does the film teach us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? This week, we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at a recent list of law films you won't want to miss that was published in US News and World Report, and that includes the most captivating legal-themed movies. What movies are on the list, what movies did not make the cut, and what can be learned about the conception of law movies and of good or great law movies when we think about that term. Well, then we'll get one film on the list that may be something of a surprise. Miracle on 34th Street, a 1947 movie written and directed by George Seaton, based on a story by Valentine Davies and featuring Maureen O'Hara, John Payne, Natalie Wood, and Edmund Gwenn. In this holiday classic, the events director of Macy's department store in New York City, Doris Walker, played by Maureen O'Hara, hires an old man named Kris Kringle, played by Edmund Gwenn, who won an Oscar as Best Supporting Actor in the role, to serve as Macy's Santa Claus after the prior Santa is fired for drinking on the job. Kringle not only resembles Santa Claus, but he believes he's Santa. He's welcomed into Doris's home and makes a very favorable impression on Doris's daughter, Susan, played by Natalie Wood, who Doris somewhat sternly has raised not to believe in fairy tales. Kringle also makes quite an impression at work. He advises one customer to go to another store when Macy's can't fulfill her son's request for a particular toy instead of trying to sell her something else that Macy's has in stock. This turns out to be a public relations stroke of genius, demonstrating Macy's concern for and loyalty to its customers. But Kringle's success at Macy's is short-lived. He gets into a dispute with another employee who is convinced Kringle is delusional and insists he be fired and put in a mental hospital. A civil commitment hearing takes place where the question centers on whether Kringle's belief that he is Santa Claus shows he's insane. While not often thought of as a law movie, Miracle on 34th Street raises interesting questions about how law should treat beliefs, as well as a glimpse into a mid-century civil commitment proceeding. My guest this episode is Ashley Merryman, who, among other things, is the author of the list, Law Films You Won't Want to Miss. Ashley is the best-selling author of two books. Ashley's book, Nurture Shock, co-authored with Poe Bronson, was on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 6 months and was an Amazon top nonfiction 100 book for over a year. It's been translated into 20 languages. Their follow-up, Top Dog, The Science of Winning and Losing, was another instant New York Times bestseller with foreign translations around the world. Ashley writes for US News and World Report, where she writes about the business and practice of law. She's also written for Newsweek, the New York Times, Time Magazine, Washington Post, CNN.com, The Guardian, ESPN, and other publications. She has 2 degrees which are particularly relevant to this podcast. One is a Bachelor of Fine Arts from USC's School of Cinematic Arts, as well as a JD from Georgetown University. Ashley, it was great to read your Law Films You Won't Want to Miss piece in US News and World Report, and it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. And I mean, I interviewed you for the piece, so you already were a big help in informing my thinking in terms of what should be on the list and not.
Yeah, it's such a great idea to kind of think about movie lists as a law movie list, and people can find the article. It's posted in the show notes. We'll read out the 10 movies that made it and kind of just see what led you to put these on the list and what didn't make the cut but might have. So the top 10 movies in alphabetical order, not in any order of ranking, are 12 Angry Men from 1957, Anatomy of a Murder from 1959, A Few Good Men from 1992, Erin Brockovich from 2000, Inherit the Wind from 1960, Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, The Lincoln Lawyer, 2011, Marshall, 2017, Miracle on 34th Street, 1947, My Cousin Vinny from 1992, To Kill a Mockingbird from 1962, The Trial of the Chicago 7 from 2020, and last but not least, in my view anyway, Witness for the Prosecution from 1957. So, Ashley, how did you go about making this list, and what were some of the things that led you to put these movies on it as opposed to some others?
Well, it was interesting. It sort of became this existential question. What is a law film? Right? And some things just sort of leaped out to me. 12 Angry Men was right there at the top of the list. So I was looking for films where law or lawyers or a legal proceeding was sort of the core of the movie and it drove the story. And ideally, it actually educated people about what the practice of law really is like. There's one, I think, notable exception we'll get to on that front, but I think that, not being cavalier about the law was a thing where there were some movies that I was like, oh, this is a good movie, but it didn't make the list because I thought they were just playing too fast and loose and almost misleading people in terms of some legal issues, especially like plot points.
Taking the law seriously was a key criteria.
Well, my cousin Vinny's on the list, so taking the law legitimately might be a better way to say it than seriously.
Yeah, thoughtfully about that. Yeah, because My Cousin Vinny is, well, it's a comedy, a great comedy. And while the plot, I think, is somewhat perhaps outlandish in some respects, and I think certain features of the movie are also a little bit unrealistic, the actual courtroom scenes are quite good. I talked about it on an earlier podcast with Judge Jed Rakoff from the Southern District, who's as good a judge of the accuracy of a courtroom scene as anyone and concurs.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting about Cousin Vinny is, it's a classic fish out of water story, and it is absolutely a farce. And the things that happen outside the courtroom scenes are just literal slapstick, right? Falling down in mud, the fist fight that never happens, that kind of thing. But in the court, it's much, much more respectful to what an actual case would be. I mean, it's still just as funny. I'm not a big slapstick fan. So for me, the courtroom scenes are funnier than the slapstick. But it really is sort of paying attention to the law and not being dismissive of it and using weird legal quirks of protocol and policy to drive the story forward as opposed to something that we should just ignore as inconvenient. Because as a screenwriter, you don't want to necessarily be so slavish to the facts that you miss the story. But I think the great law films use those legal quirks to further the story rather than being so annoyance we should just ignore.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think My Cousin Vinny illustrates that well. And it sort of brings up like one of the challenges. It's easy to criticize movies about law for inaccuracies, but the challenge as a filmmaker, screenwriter, director, is you're making a movie that's supposed to have entertainment value or dramatic purpose or comedic purpose or some combination. And you have to take some degree of license. I mean, criminal proceedings and trials are, I mean, not just long, right? You can't fit a trial into 2 hours, but they're also often kind of quite prosaic, right? There's a lot of dull things that happen. So you've got to kind of telescope the action. So how do you do that? How do you kind of take that dramatic license while still being kind of true to the law in the courtroom?
I think it's about being judicious, hitting the points that are the most important. Now, most important might not, in the case of film, be the most important legal proceeding. It might be the thing that's the most important in terms of the character or the plot. But, picking those things that really can be sort of transformative in the moment.
I don't know if you have favorites on your list, but any other you particularly want to talk about on this top 10 list?
Well, actually, I really loved all of them. And I watched every movie again, with the exception of Miracle on 34th Street, because I know every word by heart. I didn't need to see that one again. But there were some that I was like, wow, I don't know if I've seen this movie since it was originally released. And it was also interesting because I was ending up watching 5 or 6 legal movies back to back, just sitting on a Saturday, binging, ding, ding, ding. And that also changed how I thought about what made a good legal movie, like in real time, something I thought would be great. And then I would watch something else. Yeah, oh yeah, that was also around. So some of my favorites besides Miracle, I'm a huge fan of Witness of Prosecution. And I think that's one that a lot of the people who've been reading the article didn't see, and they're like, oh, well, I've seen half of them. And I just guessed that one of the ones they've missed is Witness for the Prosecution. And I'm just like, you must see Witness for the Prosecution. The
It's such a
characters
good
are
movie. Oh yeah, I
so
think. I
great.
mean, well, it's Billy Wilder, one of the great directors of all time, and the cast too. I mean, Charles Laughton is just amazing
Yeah.
as the kind of British English barrister in his sort of twilight of his career, as is Marlene Dietrich. I mean, it's a great movie and a great kind of story too.
Well, and one of the things in terms of what I realized what makes a great, not just good, but a great law movie is that the lawyer is facing a personal jeopardy in parallel with the jeopardy that the clients and the cases are facing. And witness for prosecution is a wonderful example of that, because as much of the concern when you're watching the movie is that Lon just got out of the hospital for having a heart attack, and you're not sure if he's going to be able to live through the trial, right? I mean, he's literally popping nitroglycerin through the entire trial. So you're as worried about him physically and him as a character as you are, will Tyrone Power be convicted of murder? And I think that that is one of the things that moves Witness for Prosecution and other movies up onto this next level. So another great example in terms of the stakes could not be higher. I mean, I wrote this a line in my article, is Marshall. Because in Marshall, you have a defendant on trial and a Black defendant in the South, or actually Connecticut, but it feels like the South, doesn't it? And he faces prison, and God knows what's going to happen when he's there. At the same time, both of the lawyers who are representing him are facing personal career threats, threats to their physical safety, difficulty and separation from their families. And if they don't win the case, the entire NAACP legal program will go away. So in every aspect, every motion, every press statement, every joke or little barb between the two of them has so many more ramifications than just your average court case. And each one of those would have been an amazing story, but to have all of them simultaneously, and it's a true story, is just, it's amazing.
Another one I like on your list, I mean, they're all great, is Anatomy of a Murder. I think is one of the most realistic in terms of the way it depicts the courtroom scenes. Yeah, we covered this on an earlier podcast with Jimmy Stewart as the small town lawyer defending the ex-Marine who was accused of murder. Love to hear you talk about that one, because that has some other stakes too, but I think it's like such a good courtroom movie.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of the quintessential courtroom movie in terms of how does a trial operate? And that trial is not necessarily about determining truth, but it's about the arguments between the lawyers and the grandstanding or which thing is submitted as much as what happens. I'm still not as completely sure I know what happens as I am when I started watching that movie. And I mean, I love Jimmy Stewart, but I don't think people mostly would think of Jimmy Stewart as an anti-hero, and he borders on that in this movie. The first thing he tells the young woman whose husband is on trial, and the reason he's on trial is because he learns that she's been raped by someone he's been, whether he does or does not kill. And instead of, the story of being comforting or supportive to the victim, Jimmy Stewart's all about, here's what I want you to wear and here's what I want you to act like. And it comes across as so manipulative. Now, granted, Lee Remick's victim is not very likable and sympathetic as a victim either. She's this coquettish, flirty, we don't know what's going on with her either. So there's really no characters to root for. And that even includes Jimmy. And you just look at Jimmy Stewart and you want to root for him. So it's kind of amazing, right? But I think it's interesting. And I made a point of watching the next day or so. I wanted to have a little bit separation, but I watched Anatomy of a Fall, which is definitely, the descendant of Anatomy of a Murder. And in so many ways, it's very much the close examination of a trial and testimony and having people argue in different points of view. And then you also get this fun exposure to the French trial system, which I don't think most of us have ever seen before. So how they handle witnesses is different. But the core in terms of how a trial is about how the facts are presented and how everybody, the lawyers, the witnesses, interact as much or more than actually we'd like it to be about the facts, but it's not necessarily about them.
It's such a great point. Anatomy of Murder is about kind of a construction of a truth and sort of a little bit more cynical or darker look at a trial as not this to search for truth and justice. And I agree also on Jimmy Stewart. He made a string of movies later, I think, a little later than this, with Anthony Mann, including Winchester 73, where he's playing a kind of darker character. So he does have that aspect. And Anatomy of Fall too. Yeah, it is. It is kind of the successor to Anatomy of Murder and the dissection of the French criminal trial. A great movie.
From the title on down. But I think it's so different. And this goes back to what's a law movie, because Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is about law. It's about arguing and legal procedures and what is the right law to have. But that did not make the list, broke my heart. But in terms of, I tried to stick to things that were more about a specific case and not things that were about litigating an issue in the public or exploring something. But there really was at least one legal issue, legal dispute.
Any other movies that you felt strongly about on the list?
It's so interesting. A Few Good Men made its own case because I think that the cross between Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson is one of the most famous scenes in all of film, not just legal film, but all of film. So the impact that one exchange had kind of even made the rest of the movie moot. It's a good movie. I enjoy the movie. And it's interesting in terms of looking at legal strategy as a product of the personality of the lawyer. The Tom Cruise characters really, he's all about never seeing the inside of a courtroom, and he just wants to cut a deal no matter what the case is. So I think that was something that was, just had to be on the list, but it was kind of a interesting reason why.
When I tell people I have this podcast about law and film, look at law through film, through law, I think probably the movie that most people say, are you doing, is A Few Good Men. I think you're right. I think it's because of that iconic scene.
So one of the movies that I actually vacillated, and I did put it on the list, but I did sort of struggle with, was Erin Brockovich. And the reason I struggled with that is if someone were like, oh, well, this is, best courtroom movies. I'm like, well, then Erin Brockovich isn't on it because there's this sort of tag at the beginning where she loses a personal injury suit. But that's really just, it's set up. No one cares. There's no courtroom case. In fact, the actual subject of Erin Brockovich is we're going to settle this out of court. Can I convince you to sign a form not to go to court? But the whole movie is about the law and how law empowers people with rights, that it doesn't have to be just a lawyer who gets benefits from legal proceedings. And it's just fun to watch. And Julie Roberts is amazing. But it was sort of interesting. That was one of those moments I was like, oh, what is a law movie? Do you have to be in a courtroom? No, you don't really have to be. I'd like you to be on the list, but you didn't have to be.
I think that's such an important point because, most people think of law movies as courtroom dramas, but law sort of informs so many other aspects of society and so much of film when there's, not a courtroom. I mean, most law doesn't actually take place in a courtroom, right? And, I've covered a bunch on the movies on the podcast that have been not just courtroom movies, but movies outside courtroom. It could be like Labor Law, Norma Ray, or Kramer versus Kramer, or Marriage Story, which a little bit courtroom, but more about kind of divorce proceedings. So I think it's just a great point you make about looking outside, not just your traditional courtroom drama for like what is a law movie.
And in the also ran category, especially sort of twinned with Erin Brockovich, was A Civil Action, which stars John Travolta and is this true story. It's actually very similar in terms of the elevator pitch, right? It's about one lawyer who's trying to convince people that there's a class action suit on toxic water, which is almost the same as Erin Brockovich. They're on different coasts. She's not a lawyer. He's a personal injury lawyer in all of the bad stereotypical ways in the beginning. And, through the process of helping people is, rethinking that law should be more than just making money off of people. So that was another one that I considered, but I thought that Erin Brockovich, because it's not about a lawyer and it is outside of a court, kind of gave you a new way to think about law movies, which is why that made it to the list instead of A Civil Action.
Civil Action is great. Yeah, I just looked at that. We covered a Civil Action on the podcast as well and talk about a movie with a kind of dark message about the law. It's a civil act, not being about truth, with a search for truth.
And not a happy ending. I mean, it's sort of a middle happy ending, I guess, maybe, but it's certainly not that scene where, everyone stands up and cheers. Yay, he got exonerated. And all is well. Woo, he got the girl. It does not happen in that movie.
And I don't think anyone will be surprised that you had Kill a Mockingbird on the list. I mean, I feel like people think when they think of like righteous, upstanding lawyer, I mean, they think Gregory Peck to Kill a Mockingbird. But was it an easy choice or an obvious choice?
No, I almost cut it. I did cut it several times and I kept putting it back. And in some ways, I put it back for this sort of version of the reason I had A Few Good Men on the list. When we have that sort of cultural icon of who do you want to be as a lawyer, I think people think of him at the end of the trial walking through and everyone stands in respect. And I mean, sure, that's the lawyer I want to be. It's a great, it's a brilliant lawyer and someone who takes and does the right thing. But if you actually watch the movie, it's all told from the point of view of his young daughter. So there's very little law in the movie. He's a lawyer, but they don't talk about his work except for one off the hand, oh, you should have him do a will. If they're proving to the kids themselves that he's this great guy, the way they do that is they say that he's the best shot in the county. It's nothing to do with him being a lawyer, right? So the only law in the film is really that big, huge one sequence at the end. And how much does that actually drive the plot? And how much is that related to Scout growing up? It's unclear to me. And then there are, a few detractors who say, yeah, and then he looks like he may have covered up a murder. So that's a problem, right? So this is a little problem, right? So yeah, I was struggling with having it on. And I think I did because the Gregory Peck character does have so much respect, and it is a brilliant sequence. But when you compare that to, say, Anatomy of a Murder, where almost the whole movie takes place in a courtroom, then you start going, is that really a legal movie at all? I think it's a coming of age drama.
It's just interesting with To Kill a Mockingbird, because I think most people think of it as kind of this classic law movie or a court movie, when it's, as you said, like, actually, if you look at the number of minutes in the courtroom, it's really not.
Yeah, you just keep waiting. And that's why Kramer versus Kramer did not make the list, because it's a great movie. I rewatched it just in the past week to see how much of it held up. And there's only one moment where I was like, oh, that would never fly today. I just shuddered.
Is this the glass throwing moment?
No, it's when Dustin Hoffman kisses the total stranger at the employee Christmas party.
Yeah, that too, definitely.
And he hasn't even hired yet. And I'm like, oh my God, he's gonna be fired. Like, oh wait, it's 70s, he's fine.
Yeah, right. Definitely dated there. I mean, it's a snapshot of divorce law from that time, which is interesting, but that's a bit of an ouch moment. And as is when he has a fight with Meryl Streep, his ex-wife, we separated from, in the restaurant, and he throws the glass against the wall, which apparently was not scripted. And I think she was like quite upset about it.
So it didn't make the movie because I didn't think that the court was relevant to the plot. I think you could take the whole thing out and just have her say, I'm going to divorce you and I'm going to take the kid, and then say, no, I'm not going to take the kid, and he could argue with her. But I just don't think it moves the plot any. The reason we think of it as a law movie is because the title is Kramer versus Kramer, not because of anything and I mean, just to show you how little importance the law and the legal proceedings have, there's no indication in the movie when they actually get divorced. None. They're just separated. And then all of a sudden they're asked, divorce has happened at some point and now we're doing custody. So it's a great movie. I'm not knocking the movie, but in terms of what's the best law movie, I don't think it would be fair to put that against a movie like Judgment at Nuremberg or Witness for the Prosecution, where the whole movie is about litigation of a case.
Yeah, I was really glad to see Judgment at Nuremberg on there. I think it holds up really well, and it's just so relevant to what's happening today kind of across the world, where you have commissions of international crimes and mass atrocities and kind of the idea about war crimes trials. I was really glad to see that one on the list.
Yeah, and actually another one of the also rans that I would definitely recommend to your viewers is also a sort of descendant, if Anatomy of a Fall is a descendant, which is Judgment in Berlin, which was a film that stars Martin Sheen and Sean Penn and Sam Wanamaker, directed by Leo Penn. And what's interesting is I went back and I'd seen the movie when I was actually in film school, and I'd loved it. And I remembered it being a very tiny, independent film. I have a hunch Martin Sheen may have paid for the production himself. I'm not sure, but it's possible. And I went back and I looked at some of the, there were like 2 reviews. I think 10 people have seen it according to Rotten Tomatoes. It's nothing. So Martin Sheen plays a federal judge from New Jersey, Jewish, who is asked to temporarily put his federal judiciary in New Jersey on hold and go try and really set up a federal case in a military base in the middle of West Berlin in the 1970s, when West and East Berlin were still divided. And just after the US has signed an anti-hijacking treaty, a man hijacks a plane into West Berlin so that he can defect. And when he does, the American military says, welcome to the West. And most of the people on the plane immediately defect with him. But he's a hijacker, so they have to actually litigate it. And they're going to set up this military or American court on the military base. And so you get these fundamental questions of, does the Constitution apply here? Is it a jury trial? Is the jury going to be a handpicked group of military, or is it a group of people from the Berliner population? And I also highly recommend the book. It's written by Herbert J. Stern, the actual judge. And so I loved the fact that of any movies, to have a judge be having procedural decisions that change the outcome and talk about the judge's ethics rather than the lawyers or anything else, and that the judge is specifically making these constitutional arguments about whether or not this is appropriate. And at the time, some of the reviewers were just thinking, well, that was just some jingoistic, bombastic, blah, 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 blah. Who wants to hear about arguing about the Constitution? But the movie came out before The West Wing. So if you are a West Wing fan, you will love when Martin Sheen starts arguing about what the Constitution and his ethics require. You will love it.
I mean, it speaks to me, having spent many years representing detainees at Guantanamo and arguing over the extraterritorial application of the Constitution and does the Constitution apply beyond the formal U.S. borders and how. It speaks to me, and it's pretty rare for a film, so that's a must watch.
Yeah, I mean, it is very small, but it's also sort of an interesting moment because the film was actually shot in East and West Berlin. So you really get to actually be back in that moment of time. So it's fun, yeah. And it's interesting sort of parallel then to Judgment in Nuremberg. And he even talks about, is his decisions going to be a replication of the failings of the judges who are on trial in Nuremberg? So he's very well aware of these issues, yeah.
So one maybe also ran, I don't know, I want to ask you about, that's not on the list, but I think would be a good candidate in terms of exploring character through the courtroom is The Verdict.
Oh, yeah. I watched The Verdict. I thought about The Verdict. The American Bar Association has it on its list of best legal movies. Other people have too, and I watched it and went, no. And I mean, you gotta love Paul Newman. Who doesn't? Of course you love Paul Newman. But I think that's a really good example of a movie where the courtroom scenes in terms of law are kind of gibberish. The big things that do and don't come out, none of that's actually remotely true. Right? So, but I could have forgiven that, except for the fact that I just didn't see how any of this mattered, right? In the greater scheme of things, right? When I was talking about the stakes for Marshall and the stakes for witness of prosecution, right? He starts out, he's an alcoholic lawyer sitting in a bar. And you know what he does for the rest of the movie? He's an alcoholic lawyer who sits in the bar. He doesn't sober up. He doesn't have this big, I'm going to straighten up and fly right to save my client. Not at all. He drinks a little less. He's still drinking. He's not a good lawyer.
He does take a stand though, right? He refuses the settlement offer. So they try to pay off the woman who the hospital killed through its negligence, and everyone thinks he's going to take it. He sort of tries his chance at redemption. He's still a drinker, But
again, I don't think that's redemption. I mean, it's bad law. For those of you who were listening who are not lawyers, you have to take a settlement offer to the client. You can't just turn it down.
100%.
Right? So we're just going to set aside rules of civil procedure and talk about in the universe of it. It's still about his ego. Right? I mean, he knows how his clients are in terms of the money they need. That's actually just one more shot of glory in the courtroom for me. I think it's more than they're actually trying to right a wrong. And in some ways, and this is now decades before the Catholic Church's crisis with sexual assault responses, but the bishop actually in some ways is a more thoughtful and interesting character because he's trying to figure out how to save his hospital and cut some losses and what are the legal issues here. But he's an extra, basically glorified extra. Yeah, I mean, I think, Paul Newman, it's a great performance, but I don't think it's a good law movie.
Any other almost rans you want to mention?
Sure. Well, so I put Lincoln Lawyer on the list and Michael Clayton did not make the list. And I put those mentally sort of as twins because they're more about the thriller aspect, the lawyers in Personal Jeopardy, because bad people are after them, probably the clients are after them. But I felt that the Lincoln Lawyer used the law more as a plot and as the character. I mean, he's really wrestling with the right thing to do here. My ethical requirements are going to personally protect me and my friends. Maintaining ethics may actually physically result in harm. So the ethical dilemmas that he was having in the context of a thriller were driving the thriller plot. I think you could probably forget that Michael Clayton was a lawyer. If he was just, the fixer. And you said, oh, well, he's from some military political background and didn't have a law degree. I don't really think that movie changes much. I mean, it's a great movie, but that to me is more, it's a really brilliant chase. I don't think it's a law movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did that one on the podcast as well. And I think it's true about him being a fixer. I think the portrait of some of the other lawyers in the law firm culture in New York City, big law firm culture in the aughts is interesting and well done, but I take your point. Well, going back to one of the movies that's on the list, which I mentioned at the outset that maybe was a surprise to some, is Miracle on 34th Street. What led you to put that movie on the list?
Oh, that was the first movie on the list. As soon as I got this assignment, I said, oh, Miracle on 34th Street is going on the list. Some of that is just because it's my favorite movie, but I think it's also because it isn't appreciated as a law movie. But unlike The Verdict or Kramer versus Kramer, the law proceedings drive the plot because Santa is, well, he sort of self-commits, but now he's institutionalized and it's up to the lawyers to get him out. Even in the lead-ups, you mentioned about Big Law, the romantic lead is a lawyer and he's always talking about how the partners are pressuring him to make a good impression and how he's working so hard. And, it was a long time ago, but apparently it wasn't that much different in Big Law in terms of work-life balance back in the 30s and 40s. Yeah, but then the law, the judge and the court, they get to decide what is truth. And when you think back to what we were talking about with Anatomy of Murder, in Miracle on 34th Street, you also talk about commerce. The fact Macy's, the actual guy Macy, is called to testify about whether or not his store Santa is Santa and the real Santa. And there's this wonderful montage where he's picturing, the damage of sales this is going to have when Macy's, the biggest time of the year, and they go, there's no Santa, and then no one will want to buy Christmas presents because there's no Santa, right? So, all those swirling images. But then it also comes down to, perhaps it's, manipulative, I'm sure it is, but at some point he starts believing in Santa and, the kids' responses, right? So the impact of commerce in terms of testimony and what cases are even brought. This becomes notoriety because of Macy's and the visibility of the Santa who was in the Macy's Christmas parade. By the same token, there's also this wonderful undercurrent of politics and how politics impacts the law. And that most importantly comes from the judge himself. And one of, I think, the best examples of how politics inform court and trials, the judge is asked, before he worries about Edmund Gwenn specifically, the judge is asked to rule if there is such a thing as Santa. And he goes back to his chambers and he's like, I'm going to go consult, some law books and big things. And it's his political boss telling him, no one's going to vote for you if you don't vote for Santa.
I don't care what you do with old Whisker Puss, but if you go back in there and rule that there's no Santa Claus, you better start looking for that chicken farm right now. Why, we won't even be able to put you in the primaries.
But Charlie, listen to reason. I'm a responsible judge. I've taken an oath. How can I seriously rule that there is a Santa Claus?
All right. You go back and tell him that the New York State Supreme Court rules there's no Santa Claus. It's all over the papers. The kids read it and they don't hang up their stockings. Now, what happens to all the toys that are supposed to be in those stockings? Nobody buys them. The toy manufacturers are going to like that. So they have to lay off a lot of their employees, union employees. Now you got the CIO and the AFL against you. And they're going to adore you for it. And they're going to say it with votes. Oh, and the department stores are going to love you too. And the Christmas card makers. And the candy companies. Oh, Henry, you're going to be an awful popular fella. And what about the Salvation Army? Why, they got a Santa Claus on every corner, and they take in a fortune. But you go ahead, Henry. You do it your way. You go on back in there and tell them that you rule there's no Santa Claus. Go on. But if you do, remember this. You can count on getting just 2 votes, your own and that district attorney's out there.
The district attorney's a Republican.
So in that clip, he's talking about, how the unions are going to be impacted by the result, how, every parent's going to be upset with him because they've ruined their kid's Christmas. And the judge himself has grandchildren who won't hug him because he's trying Santa. And the little girl goes and walks away, right? And the payoff when he's talking to the political boss in the court is the best because he comes back and says, having consulted the highest legal authority.
Before making a ruling, this court has consulted the highest authority available. The question of Santa Claus seems to be largely a matter of opinion. Many people firmly believe in him. Others do not. The tradition of American justice demands a broad and unprejudiced view of such a controversial matter. This court therefore intends to keep an open mind. We shall hear evidence on either side.
He's crazy too.
Well, the highest legal authority in New York is apparently the political guy who gets you elected, which I love so much.
It demands a broad and unprejudiced view of this controversial matter, right? That's the judge says she's going to keep an open mind. And then the next scene is the defense counsel, Fred Gailey, played by John Paley, calls the prosecutor's son, who testifies that his daddy told him that there was a Santa Claus and he wouldn't lie. And so,
which is so awesome. I mean, it does. It shows about parenting and the expression on his face when his son is saying, Daddy wouldn't lie. And he's like, well, of course I wouldn't lie, honey. I think in terms of lawyer credibility, and then what actually saves Santa is the federal regulation in terms of who is the legal authority in terms of getting mail, and then it's illegal to misdirect mail, and the post office sent the death letter mail to Santa. So the United States government has recognized Santa as Santa, and under the federal supremacy clause, that means New York must also agree. That's just fantastic.
It's a great ending. I like the little kind of play too, because the defense says whether Santa exists or not, we don't know. It's an unanswerable question. It's almost like it's non-justiciable. But then the prosecution says, okay, fine, but many people might claim they're Santa. How can you prove the Kris Kringle in question, right? How can you prove you're Santa? And the defense is sort of looks like the case is over. And then the post office, right? The workers in the post office who seemed eager to get rid of this backlog of letters to Santa that they've like accumulated, right? They've got sack full. They say, oh, they read about the case in the paper. They say, let's have them delivered to Kris Kringle. And so, like you said, if the U.S. Post Office is going to deliver the letters to Kringle and thinks he's Santa Claus, well, as a matter of law and just a matter of fact, who's going to argue with the U.S. Post Office? And so he is Santa and they win the case.
Well, I think it's even more, I think it's actually on stronger legal footing than that. I mean, the first part is actually adjudicating, is there a Santa or not, right? That's where the political boss comes in. And then it's okay, now that we've said there is a Santa, now we have to prove that this is the Santa. And that's then, again, brilliant lawyering.
I'm fully aware of my client's opinions. In fact, that's the entire case against him. All these complicated tests and reports boil down to this. Mr. Kringle is not sane because he believes himself to be Santa Claus.
An entirely logical and reasonable assumption, I'm afraid.
It would be if the clerk here, or Mr. Mara, or I believed that we were Santa Claus.
Anyone who thinks he's Santa Claus is not sane.
Not necessarily. You believe yourself to be Judge Harper, yet no one questions your sanity because you are Judge Harper.
I know all about myself, young man. Mr. Kringle is the subject of this hearing.
Yes, Your Honor. And if he is the person he believes himself to be, just as you are, then he's just as sane.
Granted, but he isn't.
Oh, but he is, Your Honor.
Is what?
I intend to prove that Mr. Kringle is Santa Claus.
He's crazy too.
Granted, it was an accident, but it works. If the federal government recognizes someone as a person, and it is illegal to represent someone who is not that person, they have to be that person. The federal supremacy clause, New York can't say he's not Santa if the United States government has already said it.
Your Honor, every one of these letters is addressed to Santa Claus. The post office has delivered them. Therefore, the Post Office Department, a branch of the federal government, recognizes this man, Kris Kringle, to be the one and only Santa Claus.
Since the United States government declares this man to be Santa Claus, this court will not dispute it. Case dismissed.
So that to me is just such a smart twist on the law. I love Miracle for many reasons, but what's interesting is sort of compared to My Cousin Vinny, played as a farce. Miracle on 34th Street could be a farce and it's played straight. There's one little weird part with the psychologist and his eyebrows twisting and all of that, but mostly it's played straight. And I think that that's actually one of the things that makes it so special, because you don't expect a movie about is there or is there not Santa to be about documentary evidentiary rules. Instead, it's supposed to be about his magic. If we were pitching this to Hollywood producers and we said, and there's a courtroom movie about whether or not he's Santa, then, the expected thing would be, and then Santa is going to just come up with like a magic thing. And all of a sudden the sleigh's going to come in through the courtroom and the whole place will be lighting with colors and bells. And there'll be this demonstration of Santa's magic. And instead it rests on an evidentiary rule.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. They really do kind of ground this almost fantastical question of proving Santa Claus or someone isn't Santa Claus in this kind of almost sort of quasi-realistic legal civil commitment proceeding. It does a remarkable job. And I certainly had not thought of Miracle on 34th Street as a law movie until you kind of got me to think about it that way. But now there's a law movie. The legal realism, which you alluded to before in terms of the commercial influences on the court, the political influences, the like human influences, like everyone knows that this case is, yeah, whether he's crazy or not, there is no Santa. You can't prove there's a Santa, but everyone is kind of supports this legal fiction because of all of the surrounding pressures, right? Which, and courts kind of do that. They're sort of like, well, what is the court going to do? It's going to find the law. No, there's all kinds of external forces around courts.
And all of it's impacting it, right? The media coverage is the thing that the post office sees, which makes them send the letters, right? So all of these things are interplaying in one thing, which I think is real. Sure, there are lots of cases that we haven't ever heard about, and it's, two people, lawyer and your honor who signed this, and it's just pretty pro forma. But if you're thinking about a high pressure celebrity or just any more high visibility case, trying it in the media, how does the media impact it? How does the fact that the judge or the DA that they're running for re-election impact their choice of the case or how they're going to litigate it? How does the defense lawyers being told you need to drop this or it's bad for your career? So all of the pieces, and they do in very real ways impact litigation. And that's what I think makes this actually a great law movie instead of just the great movie.
I totally agree. And it's funny, it's a holiday. You think of it as a holiday movie too now, but Daryl Zanuck, the head of the studio, wanted to release it in May because that's when people would go see it. I guess because it was very hot then, but it's sort of an odd thing that it's now this holiday Christmas movie, but it was kind of released in the springtime.
They didn't have a holiday film market, both in movies and music, the way that we do today. So not a courtroom movie, but Me in St. Louis has Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. And, people sang it a little bit and then it kind of disappeared. And it wasn't until a remake after the war when it was sort of popularized. And those things ended up sort of catalyzing more of a Christmas season. So now we have Christmas movies. The Santa movie is always going to come out a little bit over Thanksgiving. But when this movie came out, there just wasn't that sort of substantive pegging of types of movies with content and the type of year. It just didn't happen yet.
Also, perhaps the all-time holiday movie, or one of them, It's a Wonderful Life, failed at the box office, didn't do well. Then it was, I guess, whatever it was, the license expired, it just started to run and it picked up steam, and now it's become this holiday movie. So it's really interesting to kind of look historically at how holiday movies became a thing, and things we think of as holiday movies weren't originally intended that way.
And it's actually another example of what we think of the movie and what you actually see in the movie. It's a really long time before Clarence the Angel shows up. It's a really long time before the world rewinds and the whole thing happens and he's not there, and that we think it's really the last act. It's what we think the whole movie is. So when you're watching what's almost like 3 hours, you're going, when does Clarence get here? I thought this was a Christmas movie. And it's not.
So
It's a midlife crisis. It's not a Christmas movie. I have a silly, other purely personal but fun fact reason that I love Miracle, which is that, obviously it's on 34th Street. And when I went to college, the main USC Film School campus was actually located on 34th Street in LA. And I used to always joke that it was a miracle on 34th Street that I was at school.
34th Street, it's a great on-location movie for New York. Images of the Thanksgiving Day Parade, which is when the Christmas season starts as a commercial matter, right, in New York circa 1947. So lots of interesting things in this movie, but
such a wonderful movie. And Natalie Wood as the only little girl in New York who doesn't believe in Santa, right? And she's just brilliant and almost chilling in the way she's just like, nope. And to see her again come alive in terms of her belief and the idea that her friend, there's a court case about her friend and how does that change how she sees the world. And it's a movie about Santa, so she ends up being a believer, but you could easily see it going the other way, right? And she even says, oh no, he was just a nice man with whiskers and a cane. And then that's where the magic is, that little last minute, but the rest of the movie, there's no magic. So
No, amazing. I was struck, Natalie Wood was, I mean, she started, obviously, was a child actress and, or a child actor, and was just remarkably good, in this and many other things. So certainly like kind of tragic. I was just reading more about her, and what happened to her.
The film honors her every time it's on. And as far as I can tell, my belief, there is no such thing as the remake. It's one of those movies that if, you're just sort of surfing through channels, if I see it, I have to stop. And usually, invariably, I catch it right when the little Dutch war orphan is talking to Santa. And then I burst into tears. The little war orphan. That's not the law part, but, the emotion part. And again, compared to a lot of other movies we think of as law movies, they get to court as later than they do in Miracle on 34th Street.
So just coming back to the list for a second, are there other movies on the list that made you think differently, even about Miracle on 34th Street?
Yeah, actually, Inherit the Wind. I wouldn't have put those two together. And I was going to have it on the list. I thought it was a wonderful film. But Nell Minow, who's a contributing editor at RogerEbert.com, we were talking about those two, and she put those two together because she said that both of them, the core issue that's being dealt with in the film and also being dealt with in court is, what do we believe? What do we know? And that the court process is actually the arbiter of what we believe and what we know and what we can even discuss. And I was just sort of blown away and thinking about that. So Miracle is the lighter comedy version of that, but it's still almost the opposite of Anatomy of a Murder, right? Anatomy of a Murder is about learning that courts don't really give you truth. And Inherit the Wind and Miracle on 34th Street are about how court actually can define what the society believes and accepts. And putting my lawyer hat on, it's interesting, right? The researchers who've looked at things like the acceptance of gay marriage before or after the Supreme Court opined on it. So I do think that there are, really interesting ways that courts do challenge us to think about what do we accept as society as a legitimate point of view, information. And I think both of those movies really tackle that head on. So it was kind of a fascinating twin of them. And Inherit is obviously, it's a highly stylized movie. It's not very worried about evidence rules. From the very get-go when you're watching it, that's what you're doing. They're using the play format and the courtroom format as that venue for arguing about ideas, as opposed to trying to show the veritas of court.
That connection is so interesting between the two, and to think about the court's kind of role in that and their role in defining or constructing belief. And I mean, in Miracle, I'm just thinking it's sort of everyone's investment, commercial, political, familial, in the notion of Santa Claus kind of create this power that the court ultimately kind of has to accept, right? The judges kind of push against this, saying, I'm kind of the rational, reasonable judge. How I can't find this. I have to kind of follow the law, follow the facts. There's no Santa Claus, but there are all these sort of forces come together, and the judge is kind of confronted with he won't win a second term.
And again, even his granddaughter and then his own wife say, well, you're trying Santa. How shame on you, right? So yeah, there's nowhere he's getting around this. And the idea that he wants to be this reasonable, thoughtful jurist flies out the window. And the idea that he's going to be reasonable is actually damaging. And then going back to Nell's insight in Inherit the Wind, there, Henry Morgan is the judge, but he's mostly just, tapping the gavel. It's fun to see him that young because my reference of him is a MASH. But they're, the two leads, Frederick Marsh and Spencer Tracy, and also Gene Kelly is sort of the wise reporter condimenter, are doing exactly the same thing. How are the screaming mobs going to change this proceeding? How is the reporting going to change this proceeding? Even to the point where, they're grandstanding and grabbing mics during the actual trial marches. So in some ways that the larger movements of the society are just sort of pushing themselves into court, whether or not we want them there. And even if a judge says, no, I'm not going to let that happen. And actually, I think almost the reverse is true, perhaps, with the trial of Chicago 7, which is also on my list, because there it's litigating the arguments that are happening inside, right? So it's more assertively choosing what those are, as opposed to them being reluctantly forced into them. But I think that's also another great movie in that very much conversation of what is real and what should we be talking about? And how does the law and legal proceedings reflect our society's values? Maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe it's supposed to be the dispassionate, blind justice who should be immune from the mob. On the other hand, if you don't understand what the mob is saying, then maybe you don't understand the facts of the case that they're being presented to you. and the context, which I think, Chicago 7 nails every time Bobby Seale is just, being crushed and your heart is just breaking when for the Black Panthers.
Yeah, and that was Abby Hoffman, right? Central character in the film and the trial of Chicago 7. That was his strategy. I mean, he was a master at bringing the outside into the courtroom. That's another one I covered in the podcast. And the guest was Jerry Lefcourt, who represented Abby Hoffman, was involved in the trial, was kind of talking about the kind of genius that he had to recognize you got your courtroom proceeding, but this isn't about the law. This is a political trial. And for those kind of trials, especially trials that are political in nature, have political ramifications, it's important to kind of bring in what's outside. The courts aren't walled off from what's happening. It might be different in a dry contract dispute or something else, which doesn't kind of have that dimension. But in these movies, as you mentioned, I think it's really important, and the films really do a good job of that.
On the Basis of Sex is another one that wasn't on the list, but came very close. But that is an express moment. Was that she's, they're saying, the courts aren't going to rule in favor of abolishing sex discrimination on the books because it's too much of a societal change. And her response and the epiphany is, no, actually society has changed. The law is not caught up yet. And that becomes the turning point in the movie's drama, but in terms of the actual approach for the law.
Any fun facts you discovered in compiling this list?
Well, one is sort of dark, but I was sort of surprised how many of the best movies, I expected them to deal with murder, but most of them actually dealt with rape, which I was really surprised for, especially when we were talking about historically movies in the 1940s and 60s, and I thought these were issues that weren't discussed. So Anatomy of a Murder, there's a rape, and then there's a murder. Witness for Prosecution, we're not really sure what's going on, but actually Marlene Dietrich's character, there's suggestion that there's a gang rape. He just sort of prevents it a little bit. So I was surprised that sexual violence was such an issue early on. I had originally thought about including The Accused on the list and thought that I remember when The Accused came out and that was what people talked about. This was a movie about the unmentionable subject. So it was kind of stunning to actually see these movies that were predating The Accused by decades that were also tackling it in interesting ways. I think The Accused and Jodie Foster's performance absolutely is just as powerful today as it was when the movie came out. But it was interesting culturally to see some of the things that didn't make it in that. And so my other just random fun fact, going back to sort of where we started and what is a law film, Aaron Sorkin was the bane of my existence, right? A Few Good Men, the short law movie, but again, the reason it was in there as much as for the drama of the characters as it is for the plot. Trial of Chicago 7, that was easy. The one that was really hard, The Social Network. The whole movie is a deposition. The whole movie is sitting down and reporting to lawyers what happened and how this company began and how it fell apart. But I don't think anybody thinks of it as a law movie.
No, but no reason not to.
Right. So it was at that point that I hit that sort of existential crisis of what is a law movie after all? I don't know anymore. The Social Network kind of broke me for a couple of minutes. Didn't make it in the article, but it was interesting to think about, what other movies we don't even think of as a law movie, but actually have it as an intrinsic element to the plot and the mechanism of the storytelling.
You had two in by Stanley Kramer, right? Because he did Judgment in Nuremberg and Inherit the Wind. But those wear law movie on their sleeve.
Yeah, I did think about that in terms of the repeats. Spencer Tracy's on my list a bunch of times. Jimmy Stewart was either on the list or had movies that didn't make the list. Aaron Sorkin, a bunch of movies. Stanley Kramer, a bunch of movies. So I was kind of surprised actually on that. But then I decided, that it's just creative people who are interested in movies about ideas. And as I mentioned, Nell Minow talked about that, the law itself is a great setting for conflict, because drama is conflict and litigation is inherently got to have some conflict. So I think that the combination of those things and being interested in material that's thoughtful about society, thoughtful about how conflict impacts and reveals character. And by character, I mean, a person who's a character and character in terms of ethics and the choices that we make. So I think that people who are excited and interested by that material, once they see that, then they probably are looking for other things.
And also just historically, kind of you alluded to this before, just looking at, your films dating from the 40s, I think, going back through the 2000s, looking at how the law has changed, dealing with subjects and its composition. You have 12 Angry Men, what that looks like, what the jury looks like. Although it's diverse in viewpoint, you have women on the jury, you have Anatomy of a Murder, which interestingly does kind of break ground, I think, a little bit in talking about rape, but it's interesting to see how this kind of very awkward conversation between the judge and the defense attorney and the prosecutor, all men, just how they kind of dance around it. But it's kind of interesting historically, too, to look at how the law has changed and lawyers have changed.
But it's also creepy and terrifying how much it hasn't. The legal issues relating to Inherit the Wind are about what can be taught in schools and book burning, and the power of a charismatic authoritarian leader, and the power of relitigating whether or not religion should be in schools. I mean, these are issues that we're dealing with today. When I watched Kramer, I thought Kramer was going to be more archaic because, well, we're just so much, more embracing of alternate family structures. And then I watched it and was like, no, actually, most of it's still hanging on here pretty well in terms of dealing with sexual stereotypes, people who are expected to be a particular type of character. So I was actually surprised. 12 Angry Men is front and center about how socioeconomic and racial bias impact our ability to see something and understand it. So I was kind of amazed, actually, in some ways, that not just the law, but the broader issues that they were tackling were actually just as relevant today as they were when they were made.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, you get by some of the trappings and the personnel, they've changed, they've been updated in terms of demographics, right? And some of the awkward scenes referred to earlier, that, some of the things that just seem kind of not right for today. But if you get to some underlying issues, the role of religion, gender, they're surprisingly relevant in how they speak to people in 2024.
Yeah, I think you have to kind of look at whether it's an inappropriate language or something like that. That's just sort of that window in its time to remind you. I have a new favorite thing that I'm always watching movies where people are talking on phones with cords. I'm like, oh, look, I had a phone with a cord once. That's so cool. There's a phone with a cord. Oh, they used a payphone. That's so cool.
What stands out to me is the movies that are in the transition period that have the 300-pound car phone. You're like, oh, right. They had like car phones or like gigantic cell phones. And those are like sort of transition ones that seem to me like just stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah, the portable ones that weighed pounds. Yeah, it's great. So I think you just have to sort of look past those little moments of historical anachronisms and say, well, that seems weird to us now, but that's just the way it was then. And not let that distract you from those bigger issues, which again, I think are stunningly relevant today.
Ashley, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great to talk to you about your list, which is terrific, and just to dive in on Miracle on 34th Street, a great and underappreciated law movie.
It's not just for Christmas anymore.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.
Hello again. I hope you're enjoying Law on Film. I wanted to let you know about an exciting new feature that will make it easier for listeners to engage with the podcast. If you have any questions about an episode you've listened to, whether about the law, the movie, or both, please go ahead and send them to me. At the end of each episode, I'll respond to your questions about previous episodes during our new Q&A segment. So go ahead and send any questions or comments about the films we've covered by email, jonathanhafetz@gmail.com. That's Jonathan Hafetz, all one word, @gmail.com, or just DM me on Twitter or X. Thanks again for listening. And if you like Law on Film Podcast, please make sure to rate or review us.